Chapter 19. Prisoners. "Frank!" Joe and Chet shouted, throwing aside all caution. "Frank, where are you?" The only answer was a white glare of lightning, lasting fully 3 seconds. They could see everything around them plainly. There was no doubt about it. Frank Hardy had disappeared, as completely as the 2 men carrying the box. "Oh, where is he?" Joe cried in despair, his words drowned out by a terrific blast of thunder. Now at last, as though split wide open by the latest bolt, the swollen clouds released their load of rainfall in one vast rush. Sheets of water struck the trees with a crash and hit the rocks with a loud smacking sound. But in spite of the tumult, a faint human cry from the ground underneath them reached Joe's keen ears. "Over here!" he shouted, groping through the downpour to a wide, round bush from which the cry seemed to have come. "Whoa!" Joe cried suddenly. The ground gave way beneath his feet. For an instant he felt himself falling in space. But in that moment the strong arms of Chet Morton hooked under his armpits and hauled him backwards to safety. Snapping on their flashlights, the 2 boys trained them downward and discovered the mouth of a deep, wide hole, cleverly hidden by the round bush. As they peered below in amazement at the narrow wooden slide, a familiar voice sounding far away called up from below. "Joe! Chet!" It was Frank. Carefully, Joe and Chet sat down on the slide, grasping the sides. In spite of their caution, they were soon whizzing through the darkness. They tumbled in a heap at the bottom, but quickly leapt to their feet. "Turn on your flashlights," directed Frank. "I lost mine when I fell." The yellow beam suddenly lit up a fairly high, rock-walled chamber, with passages leading from it in several directions. "This must be the gang's hideout," said Joe in a low voice. "They must slide their stolen goods down that chute." Cautiously, the 3 friends moved along one of the rock passageways. Abruptly, it was blocked by a low wooden door. "Should we open it?" Joe whispered. "It might be a trap." "We can't stop now," muttered Frank. Boldly, he stepped forward and pushed. The heavy door swung noiselessly inward. In the next instant, the Hardys and Chet gasped in disbelief. A single kerosene lantern dimly illuminated the square, rock-hewn room. A man with a dirty bandage wrapped around his disheveled gray hair lay upon a cot. Slowly, he turned dull, sunken eyes upon them. "Captain McGuire!" cried Frank, rushing forward. The expression in the man's eyes changed instantly to one of lively hope. "Joe! Frank! Your father got my letter! Thank goodness! Where is Fenton?" Shakily, the man sat up. Evidently, he was still weak from the wound in his head. "Dad couldn't get here," Frank explained, "so he sent us." Frank introduced Chet, and then went on. "We've been hunting you for days, Captain. Right now, we must be careful. We don't know where Donner and his gang may be, and we don't want to be captured." When he heard that the boys were alone, Captain McGuire's joy became mixed with concern. "I can tell you where Donner is," he answered. "He and several of his pals are in the cabin. There's a passageway to it through that other door." He pointed to the one across the room. As the captain paused, the boys noticed his torn shirt. The scraps that they'd found in the hollow were of the same plaid flannel. "You must go for help, boys," he urged. "This gang has been hijacking equipment from those nose cones of rockets. They've also been stealing furs and surgical equipment, and whatever else they dare. They're smart and they'll stop at nothing." "We'll go back up the shaft," proposed Chet. I noticed some steps on one side. And we'll take you with us, sir. We can't leave you here. But if the gang finds the captain gone now, Frank pointed out thoughtfully, they'll know that the game is up and clear out. Frank's right, agreed McGuire. You go then, Chet, Joe decided. Frank and I will stay here and look out for the captain. After Chet left, Captain McGuire began his story. When the screams first started, I didn't think too much of it. But then dogs began disappearing too. So recalling the hex legend, I began noting it on my calendar, the dates on which I heard the screams, as well as any dogs that were missing. Soon I became convinced that there was a connection, and something underhanded was going on. I even suspected the hollow might be a hideout for hijackers. That's why I sent for your father. And then one night, my Cocker Spaniel Ginger was stolen, and I decided to investigate alone. The boys nodded, and Frank said, "That's when you were captured." "Yes," the captain replied sadly. "I took my gun that night, and I began searching the hollow. I heard something in the bushes, and I asked who it was. There was no answer. And then I saw 2 glaring eyes and heard a scream. It was the puma. I gave it both barrels, but I missed." "Yes, we found your shells," Joe said. "Donner heard the shots, sneaked up behind and slugged me," the captain continued. "The next thing I knew, I was in his cabin, and he was pushing aside a section of rock wall in the kitchen. There was a wooden door behind it. I pretended I was still out. He dragged me down a passageway, past a room with a barred door, and then under the low doors to this room, and dumped me on this cot. I've been here ever since. My only hope has been that your father had received my letter and would come and try to find me. And all this time, Dad was working on the same case over in New Jersey," Joe marveled. Quickly, Frank informed the captain of the boys' own sleuthing, including Weber's claim that McGuire owed him money. "A lie," said the captain in disgust. "It's just an excuse to spy on you boys at the cabin." Frank concluded his account with the boys' suspicion that the owls' sounds were being made by humans and used as signals. "You're right there," confirmed McGuire. "I've learned that much since I've been in here. Donner warns the hijackers not to come by faking the screech of the barn owl. I guess he's been using it a lot since you boys got here. And then the wailing of the screech owl means that the coast is clear. It's okay to deliver the goods," Joe finished. "That's absolutely right," came a deep, familiar voice from the door leading to the cabin. Whirling, the Hardys found themselves facing the long, silver barrel of Walter Donner's pistol. The gang leader had quietly pushed open the door to the cell and heard the last part of the conversation. He was followed by big, rough-looking men, and then the lawyer, Wyckoff Weber. "My congratulations," said Donner in a mocking tone. "You've solved the case very cleverly, through the clue of the Screeching Owl. By the way, I did the screeching and wailing myself. Pretty good, eh?" And then the big man's voice took on the tone of menace. "But it won't do you any good. Your reward will be to meet the screaming witch herself." Wondering, Frank and Joe were prodded by the muzzle of Donner's gun down the rock passageway toward the cabin and into the cell with the barred door that Captain McGuire had mentioned. "Saki," called Donner harshly to a rough-looking man, "go get that third kid." Meanwhile, Frank and Joe looked around the rock-walled room by the feeble light of Donner's flashlight. They noticed that the rear wall was covered by a tarp. The air was heavy and moist, as in most underground chambers, but there was also a strange, rank odor. "Do you like your new quarters?" taunted Donner, indicating the rock walls. All these chambers and passages were hewn out of natural caverns by the abolitionists when they built the cabin against the very front of the rock wall. "Very clever people," he went on affably. "They were the ones who revived the witch legend by stealing dogs and faking screams to keep people away from the hollow while they hid runaway slaves. Don't you admire my extensive historical research?" "At least they had a good motive," said Frank defiantly. "They didn't steal dogs to cover up a hijacking racket." "By the way, we know where Bobby Thompson's Skippy is." Donner looked startled for a moment, and then he said, "I don't know what you're talking about." He went on mockingly, "I fooled you boys with the hideous face in the woods. It wasn't Simon. I wore a rubber mask with a black wig." "Skip the talk," snapped Joe. "What are you going to do with us?" Realizing that he could not shake the boy's nerve, the tall man abruptly crossed the room to the tarp-covered wall. "Meet the witch!" cried Donner, ripping away the canvas. The faint light showed the bars of a cage, and behind them the fierce green eyes and powerful body of a big, tawny brown puma. "Some of the screams were his," said Donner. "When I heard that my brother William, your Colonel Thunder, was going to have this beast destroyed because it almost killed him, I sent Saki to get the animal from him. I felt that such a pet would be helpful in reviving the witch legend. But William wasn't told that I wanted it, nor why. The puma knows who's master here, at any rate," the gang raider added with a cruel voice. "William and I don't have anything to do with each other, but he did warn my lawyer that some snoopers said I was stealing dogs. And then Weber set Captain McGuire's cabin on fire and tried to burn us to death," said Joe, looking sharply at the lawyer's ragged left shoe. But the youth did not reveal his clue as to the telltale prints that he found near the scene of the razed cabin. He was sure that Sheriff Ecker's casts of the footprints would be conclusive evidence. "I deny that!" cried Weber. "You can't prove it." "Oh, yes, we can," Joe told him. Frank interrupted. "This puma was loose in the hollow tonight, wasn't it?" "That's right," Donner admitted. "I sometimes let him through the door you see at the rear of his cage. It leads out into the rocks. But I only let him out after I've put a sleeping pill in his food. He usually comes back quietly. However," he added meaningfully, "tonight the effects of his last pill wore off sooner than I expected. That's why I had to warn my men to lie low right after I'd given them the all-clear. Fortunately, my pet came back without harming anyone. By the way, the grating between yourselves and this animal can be raised. Just yank the chain here. At the same time, the puma's outside door will be raised, so if you want to escape, the way out is very simple. All you have to do is get past the puma." Walter Donner stepped back into the passage and slammed the door to the boys' prison and shot the heavy bolt into place. "Oh, I forgot to tell you," came his mocking voice from the corridor. "There is another chain, with which I can raise only the grating between you and the puma. I'll get around to it sometime tonight." Luckily, Joe had hidden his flashlight inside his shirt. Now left alone, the brothers carefully examined the walls of their prison. "No way out," concluded Joe. "Our only hope is that Chet got away, all right, and that he can return with the state police before Donner lifts that grating." Switching off the flashlight, the two boys waited tensely in the pitch darkness. A few feet away, the big cat could be heard pacing nervously. After a long silence, Frank and Joe heard voices in the corridor outside. "Did you get that fat kid?" asked Donner. "You can forget him, boss," came the rough voice of the strong-armed man, Saki. "I see him pull out in this yellow convertible, so I take off after him in the truck. Pretty soon I see his lights, pretty far ahead, going around a turn. And then in a couple minutes I hear this terrific crash, like a car going right over the edge, down the hollow. I come up and there's wreck way down below, burning up like mad. Nobody could have lived through it." "Good," snapped Walter Donner. "That takes care of him." Frank and Joe stood as if frozen, in utter horror. End of chapter 19.